The moment they dragged that little girl off the plane, everyone assumed she'd done something wrong. 3 hours later, when the pilot was screaming her call sign over the radio, those same people realized she was the only reason they were still alive. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Maya Rodriguez felt every pair of eyes burning into her back as the gate agent's voice cut through the boarding area like a knife. "Miss, I'm going to need you to step aside right now." The words weren't a request, they were a command wrapped in barely professional courtesy, the kind of tone that immediately tells everyone watching that something is wrong, that someone has violated the rules, that a problem passenger needs to be dealt with before they can disrupt everyone else's carefully scheduled travel plans. Maya's fingers tightened around her boarding pass, the paper crinkling slightly as she stood frozen at the podium while 247 passengers waiting behind her began whispering to each other, craning their necks to see what kind of trouble this 11-year-old had caused, why she was holding up the boarding process, what sort of parents would let their child travel alone without proper documentation. "There's clearly an issue with your ticket," the gate agent continued, her name tag reading, Patricia Williams, Customer Service Supervisor, as if the title gave her absolute authority to make pronouncements about who deserved to fly and who needed to be removed from the aircraft before they became everyone else's problem. Patricia's perfectly manicured fingernails clicked against the keyboard with increasing aggression as she pulled up screen after screen of information, her expression hardening with each passing second into something that looked almost triumphant, as if she'd discovered exactly the justification she needed to resolve this complication. "You're listed as an unaccompanied minor, but I'm not seeing the proper documentation in the system, and according to our records, there's no adult registered to receive you at your destination airport. That's a major liability issue we simply cannot overlook, regardless of whatever arrangements you think were made." Maya opened her mouth to explain that her grandmother had completed all the paperwork weeks ago, that she'd flown this route 6 times before without any problems, that she had confirmation emails and printed documents in her backpack proving everything had been properly arranged through the airline's official unaccompanied minor program. But Patricia cut her off with a raised hand and that smile adults use when they've already decided you're wrong and nothing you say will matter because they're the authority figure and you're just a kid who doesn't understand how the real world works. "I understand you probably think your parents handled everything correctly, but what I'm seeing in our system tells a very different story. We have strict federal regulations about unaccompanied minors, and I'm not going to risk this airline's operating certificate or my own professional reputation by allowing you to board when the documentation isn't properly filed." The passengers immediately behind Maya in line began muttering loud enough for her to hear every word of their judgment. "Unbelievable that parents would just send their kid to the airport without proper arrangements," a businessman in an expensive suit said to his colleague, shaking his head with the confidence of someone who'd never made a mistake in his entire privileged life. "Probably thought they could save money by not paying the unaccompanied minor fees, and now this poor gate agent has to deal with the consequences while the rest of us miss our connections." A woman clutching a designer handbag leaned toward her traveling companion and whispered in that voice people use when they want you to overhear their criticism, "I swear, some people have no business being parents if they can't even manage to fill out basic travel forms." That little girl looks terrified, and it's entirely her parents' fault for putting her in this situation. Patricia called over her shoulder toward the desk behind the podium, "Stephen, I need security assistance at gate 42 for a passenger removal situation. We have an unaccompanied minor without proper documentation who needs to be escorted from the boarding area before we can begin the process." Within 90 seconds, 2 airport security officers appeared, their uniforms and official demeanor immediately confirming to everyone watching that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding but a legitimate security concern that required professional intervention. The younger officer, barely out of his 20s and clearly uncomfortable with the assignment, approached Maya with an apologetic expression that didn't match the authority his position required him to project. "Miss, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with us. The gate agent has indicated there's an issue with your travel documents that needs to be resolved before you can board this aircraft." Maya felt her cheeks burning with humiliation as 300 eyes watched her pick up her small backpack and follow the security officers away from the gate, away from the aircraft she was supposed to board, away from the Seattle destination where her grandmother waited with increasing worry about why the airline's tracking system would soon show her granddaughter hadn't boarded the scheduled flight. She wanted to cry, wanted to scream that this wasn't fair, that she'd done everything right, that the paperwork was filed correctly and someone had simply made a clerical error in the airline's computer system. But her father had taught her before his death that showing emotion in crisis situations only made things worse, that maintaining composure under pressure was the mark of someone who could be trusted when everything was falling apart, that dignity in the face of unfair treatment said more about your character than 1,000 protests ever could. Probably a runaway, one passenger said to another as Maya walked past their row of seats near the gate. You can tell by the way she's dressed, like she just grabbed whatever was in her closet and bolted. Parents are probably frantic right now trying to find her. Another traveler, a middle-aged woman who considered herself an expert on child behavior based on raising 3 kids of her own, nodded knowingly and added her own assessment to the growing chorus of judgment. I noticed her earlier, standing alone and looking nervous. Something about her body language just screamed, this child is not supposed to be here. The gate agent absolutely did the right thing by refusing to let her board, even if it delays our departure by a few minutes. The security officers led Maya to a small office adjacent to the gate area where airport supervisors handled passenger complaints and documentation issues, a windowless room with harsh lighting and uncomfortable plastic chairs that smelled like stale coffee and the accumulated stress of 10,000 travel disputes. The older officer, whose name badge identified him as Ronald Martinez with 23 years of airport security experience, gestured for Maya to sit down while he reviewed the information Patricia had forwarded to his tablet. Look, kid, I'm not trying to give you a hard time here, but the airline has rules for unaccompanied minors that exist for your protection. If the proper paperwork isn't in the system showing who's supposed to pick you up in Seattle and confirming that your parents or legal guardians completed the required forms, then we simply cannot allow you to board that aircraft. It's not personal, it's federal aviation regulations. Maya finally spoke, her voice steady despite the injustice burning in her chest like rocket fuel waiting to ignite. My grandmother filed all the paperwork 3 weeks ago. I have confirmation emails with reference numbers. This is the 7th time I've flown this exact route using the unaccompanied minor program, and I've never had any problems before today. Someone made a mistake in your computer system, and instead of taking 60 seconds to verify my documentation, that gate agent decided it was easier to remove me from the flight and make it my problem to solve. The words came out with a precision that surprised both security officers, the kind of articulate pushback they didn't expect from an 11-year-old who should have been crying or throwing a tantrum or behaving like the difficult child they'd assumed they were dealing with. Ronald exchanged glances with his younger colleague, and for a moment something like doubt flickered across his weathered features, the recognition that maybe this situation wasn't as straightforward as Patricia had presented it. But procedure was procedure, and his job required following the airline's directives regardless of his personal assessment of the passenger's credibility. I understand your frustration, and you're certainly more articulate than most adults I deal with in this office. But until we can verify your documentation and confirm that everything is properly filed in the airline system, I cannot authorize your return to that aircraft. The flight is scheduled to depart in 40 minutes, and honestly, given the backlog of verification requests our passenger services department is dealing with today, I don't think we're going to resolve this in time for you to make this particular flight. Back at Gate 42, the boarding process continued without Maya, passengers filing onto the aircraft with their carry-on luggage and their complete indifference to the small drama that had briefly interrupted their travel plans. Patricia made an announcement over the public address system with satisfaction evident in her tone, informing waiting passengers that the documentation issue had been resolved and boarding would now proceed normally, as if removing an 11-year-old from the flight represented efficient problem-solving rather than a potential catastrophic mistake. Flight 2847 was a Boeing 737-800 configured for 175 passengers, and today it was flying at near capacity with business travelers heading to Seattle for tech industry conferences, families returning home from Texas vacations, and the usual mixture of humanity that fills commercial aircraft on any given afternoon. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Hayes completed his pre-flight checklist with the practiced efficiency of a pilot who'd logged 32 years and over 20,000 flight hours with the airline, most of those hours accumulated before the aviation industry became dominated by cost-cutting measures and schedule pressures that turned flying from a profession into a glorified bus service. His first officer, Jessica Chen, was a talented aviator in her own right with 12 years of commercial flying experience, and together they represented exactly the kind of experienced flight crew that passengers assumed would handle any situation that might develop during the routine 3.5-hour flight to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Neither pilot had any idea that the passenger manifest they'd reviewed 30 minutes earlier contained a name that should have meant something to anyone familiar with military aviation history, a name that connected to a call sign legendary enough that veteran Air Force pilots still spoke about it with reverence in ready rooms across the country. Maya Rodriguez, 11 years old, daughter of the late Major Carlos Falcon Rodriguez, who had earned his call sign through extraordinary valor during combat missions that saved countless lives and inspired an entire generation of fighter pilots to push beyond what they thought possible. Maya herself had earned the honorary use of that same call sign 2 years earlier, not through combat but through a different kind of battle that required equal courage and inspired the same reverence among the military community that had loved her father. At 9 years old, she'd been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a cancer that should have destroyed her childhood and possibly her life, but instead became the arena where she demonstrated the same unbreakable spirit her father had shown in combat. During 18 months of brutal chemotherapy at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, Maya had become a legend among the wounded warriors and sick children who filled those halls with their pain and their hope and their determination to survive what should have killed them. The fighter pilots recovering from combat injury started calling her Little Falcon after they learned whose daughter she was, and then just Falcon when they realized she'd earned the call sign on her own merits through the grace and courage she showed while poison pumped through her veins to kill the cancer trying to kill her. She attended every aviation medicine lecture the hospital offered, absorbed technical knowledge from the pilots who visited her during their own rehabilitation, studied flight manuals and emergency procedures with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was power and preparation was survival. The Air Force Thunderbirds had visited her during one of their East Coast tours, and after spending an afternoon with Maya discussing aerodynamics and emergency protocols and the mental discipline required to fly high-performance aircraft, the squadron commander had officially recognized her honorary call sign in a ceremony that brought hardened combat veterans to tears. None of that history sat in the computer systems that Patricia Williams had consulted before removing Maya from Flight 2847. None of that context appeared in the database that Ronald Martinez reviewed while keeping an 11-year-old locked in a security office instead of letting her board the aircraft where she belonged. And none of those remarkable credentials mattered to the passengers who judged her as a problematic child whose parents couldn't manage basic travel arrangements, because people see what they expect to see, and what they expected from an 11-year-old was helplessness, incompetence, and the need for adult supervision in every aspect of navigating a complex world. Flight 2847 pushed back from the gate at exactly 3:47 p.m. Central Time, 12 minutes behind schedule due to the delay caused by Maya's removal, but still within the acceptable margin that wouldn't trigger passenger compensation requirements or raise concerns with the airline's operational performance metrics. The aircraft taxied toward the runway while Captain Hayes and First Officer Chin completed their taxi checklist, verified their flight plan routing, and prepared for a normal departure into the scattered clouds that dotted the Texas afternoon sky. In the passenger cabin, flight attendants moved through the familiar choreography of safety demonstrations that nobody watched anymore, pointing out emergency exits and oxygen mask procedures and flotation devices that 247 passengers ignored while scrolling through their phones during the final seconds before cellular service became unavailable. Maya sat in the security office watching the clock on the wall count away the minutes of a flight she should have been on, her jaw clenched with frustration that had nowhere to go except inward, forming a hard knot of anger at the injustice of adults who wielded power without wisdom and made decisions without accountability. Ronald had left her alone 20 minutes earlier to coordinate with the airline's passenger services department, promising he was working to resolve the documentation issue but offering no timeline for when that resolution might occur. Through the office's small window, she could see other flights boarding and departing, could watch the normal rhythm of airport operations continuing without any awareness that something important had been disrupted, that someone had been wrongly excluded from where she was supposed to be. Flight 2847 climbed through 15,000 feet, its twin engines performing flawlessly as the Boeing 737 ascended toward its assigned cruising altitude of 37,000 feet on a northwestern trajectory that would take it across the heartland of America toward the Pacific Northwest. The cockpit voice recorder captured routine communications between Captain Hayes and air traffic control, standard callouts between pilot and first officer, the unremarkable audio of a normal flight operating exactly as thousands of flights operate every single day across the American aviation system. In the cabin, passengers settled into their seats for the long flight, some opening laptops to work, others putting on headphones to watch downloaded movies, a few trying to sleep despite the cramped discomfort of economy-class seating designed to maximize airline revenue rather than human comfort. At 33 minutes into the flight, while the aircraft leveled off at its assigned cruise altitude and the seatbelt sign chimed off to allow passengers freedom to move about the cabin, Captain Richard Hayes felt a sudden stabbing pain behind his left eye that turned his vision white and sent his hands involuntarily clutching at his head. The pain intensified with the speed of a freight train accelerating toward a brick wall, and within 15 seconds he was gasping against agony that felt like someone had inserted a red-hot spike directly into his brain and was twisting it with malicious intent. First Officer Chen looked over from her seat and saw her captain's face contorted in suffering, saw his hands trembling as he tried to key the microphone to declare an emergency, saw him struggling to maintain consciousness against something that was shutting down his nervous system with terrifying efficiency. Richard? Richard, talk to me. Jessica's voice carried the edge of panic that even professional training couldn't completely suppress when your cockpit crewmates suddenly became incapacitated at 37,000 feet with 247 souls depending on two pilots to safely control 85 tons of aircraft, fuel, and humanity. Captain Hayes tried to respond but managed only an incoherent groan before his body went rigid and he slumped forward against his restraint harness, unconscious and completely unresponsive to Jessica's increasingly desperate attempts to revive him. She immediately pressed the call button to summon the senior flight attendant to the cockpit while simultaneously transmitting on the emergency frequency, Mayday, 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 Denver Center, Southwest 2847 declaring medical emergency, Captain incapacitated, requesting immediate priority handling and medical assistance upon landing. The head flight attendant, Margaret Sullivan, a 28-year veteran who dealt with more in-flight medical emergencies than she cared to remember, entered the cockpit and immediately assessed the catastrophic situation developing in the left seat. Captain Hayes was completely unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that suggested something far worse than a simple fainting spell or dehydration. Margaret had completed advanced medical training and recognized the signs of what was likely a massive cerebral hemorrhage or stroke, the kind of sudden neurological catastrophe that could kill a healthy person in minutes and was now threatening to turn this routine flight into a disaster that would dominate news coverage for weeks. "I need someone with medical training immediately," Margaret announced over the passenger address system, her voice professionally calm despite the crisis unfolding behind the locked cockpit door. "If there are any doctors, nurses, paramedics, or individuals with emergency medical experience on board, please identify yourselves to a flight attendant right now." 3 passengers responded within seconds, a pediatric nurse from Houston, an emergency room physician heading to a Seattle medical conference, and a retired paramedic traveling to visit grandchildren. Margaret rushed them forward to the cockpit where they began assessing Captain Hayes with the urgent efficiency of medical professionals who understood they were working in the worst possible environment with minimal equipment and zero backup. First Officer Jessica Chen, now the sole functioning pilot on an aircraft carrying 247 people across the American Midwest at 520 miles per hour, forced herself to compartmentalize the fear threatening to overwhelm her training and focus exclusively on the immediate tasks that would keep this aircraft flying while they figured out how to get it safely back on the ground. She verified the autopilot was maintaining their altitude and heading, confirmed their fuel status showed enough reserves to divert to multiple alternate airports, and began processing the overwhelming checklist of procedures that came with being the only conscious pilot on a commercial aircraft experiencing a captain incapacitation emergency. Denver Air Traffic Control immediately cleared all conflicting traffic from their flight path and began coordinating emergency medical response at the nearest suitable airport. But 47 seconds after Jessica transmitted the initial Mayday call, while she was still processing the captain incapacitation checklist and preparing to execute a turn back toward Denver, the Boeing 737's master caution system illuminated with an amber glow that made her stomach drop into her feet. The warning screen showed hydraulic pressure loss on the number 1 system, and before she could even begin diagnosing that problem, a second warning appeared indicating that the number 2 hydraulic system was also showing pressure loss. Within 30 additional seconds, the number 3 system joined its companions in failure, and Jessica found herself staring at a situation that every pilot trains for in simulators but prays never to encounter in actual flight: a complete hydraulic system failure that eliminated normal flight control authority over the aircraft. Denver Center, Southwest 2847, we are now showing complete hydraulic failure on all 3 systems, losing normal flight control authority. This situation has escalated beyond single pilot capability, Jessica transmitted with her voice shaking despite every effort to maintain professional composure. The air traffic controller on the other end of that radio frequency felt his own adrenaline spike as he recognized what those words meant. A complete hydraulic failure on a Boeing 737 meant the pilot had lost conventional control over the ailerons, elevators, rudder, flaps, and landing gear, leaving only minimal trim controls as potential methods to maintain some semblance of controlled flight. The emergency room physician working on Captain Hayes in a cramped cockpit looked up at Jessica with an expression that confirmed her worst fears. This man has suffered a massive stroke or brain hemorrhage. His pupils are unequal and non-reactive, his breathing is becoming agonal, and without immediate neurosurgical intervention he's not going to survive the next 30 minutes. But even if we could land right now and rush him into surgery, I honestly don't think he's going to make it. I'm sorry, but you need to understand the reality of what we're dealing with here. Margaret Sullivan recognized that Jessica was about to face impossible circumstances alone, and she made an executive decision that flight attendants are authorized to make during extreme emergencies when crew coordination becomes a matter of survival. I'm going to check the passenger manifest to see if we have anyone on board with aviation experience who might be able to assist you. I know it's not standard procedure, but we are so far beyond standard procedure right now that we need to consider every possible resource. She pulled up the electronic manifest on the cabin management system and began scanning through the passenger list looking for anyone whose profile might indicate military service, aviation background, or professional credentials that suggested capability in crisis situations. And that's when Margaret's eyes stopped moving, frozen on a name that appeared in the manifest with a notation she'd seen before but never fully understood the significance of until this exact moment. The passenger database showed Rodriguez, Maya, UMNR, with a military-dependent identifier and an unusual notation in the Special Services field that read, Honorary USAF call sign, Falcon, daughter of Major Carlos Rodriguez, Kia, Aviation Knowledge Certified. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as fragmented memories suddenly assembled into coherent recognition. She remembered the news coverage from 2 years ago about the little girl battling cancer who'd become an inspiration to wounded warriors at Walter Reed, remembered the Air Force Thunderbird ceremony that had granted her the same call sign her fighter pilot father had carried before his death in combat. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, her hand covering her mouth as the full weight of what had happened at the gate crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. They had removed from this aircraft the one passenger whose knowledge and composure might make the difference between a miraculous survival and a catastrophic disaster, had escorted her away from the flight because of a paperwork error that some gate agent was too impatient to properly verify. Margaret grabbed the internal phone connecting her to the cockpit and spoke rapidly to Jessica, her words tumbling over themselves in urgent succession. There was a passenger removed from this flight at boarding, an 11-year-old girl named Maya Rodriguez who carries the honorary Air Force call sign, Falcon, and has extensive aviation knowledge from her military family background and her time at Walter Reed with combat pilots. According to this manifest notation, she's been certified by Air Force aviation medicine personnel as having advanced understanding of emergency procedures and aircraft systems. She might be able to help you. Jessica's mind raced through the implications of what Margaret was telling her, weighing the absurdity of considering assistance from an 11-year-old against the desperate reality that she was alone in a cockpit with a dying captain and an aircraft that was rapidly becoming uncontrollable through conventional means. She'd heard stories about Falcon Rodriguez through the pilot community, knew the legend of the little girl who'd earned her call sign through courage that humbled grown men, understood that some people possessed knowledge and composure that transcended age or experience. The alternative was trying to manage this emergency completely alone while second-guessing every decision and wondering if there was someone who might have seen something she was missing. Contact the gate, contact airport operations, contact whoever you need to contact and get Falcon back to this aircraft immediately, Jessica commanded with the absolute authority of a pilot in command making a decision that defied every conventional regulation but aligned perfectly with the desperate circumstances requiring desperate measures. I don't care what it takes or who has to authorize it, that girl needs to be on the radio with me right now walking me through options I might not be seeing. Back in the security office at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, Maya had been watching the flight tracking display on her phone showing Flight 2847's progress when the aircraft symbol suddenly changed from green to orange and the status updated to, Emergency, Medical. Her trained eye immediately recognized something catastrophic was developing, and every instinct her father had taught her before his death started screaming that something was terribly wrong with the aircraft she should have been aboard. Ronald Martinez burst through the office door with his radio squawking urgent traffic from airport operations, his face flushed with exertion and barely contained panic as he tried to process information that made no logical sense. Maya Rodriguez, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, Ronald said, his professional composure cracking under the weight of impossible circumstances. Flight 2847 has declared an emergency. The captain has been incapacitated by what appears to be a massive stroke, and the aircraft has suffered complete hydraulic failure leaving the first officer with minimal control authority. The senior flight attendant accessed the passenger manifest and found notations about your military aviation knowledge and your honorary Air Force call sign. The pilot in command has specifically requested that you be connected to the cockpit immediately to provide consultation on emergency procedures. Maya's shock at hearing those words lasted approximately 3 seconds before her training took over and she was moving toward the door with the focused intensity of someone who'd been preparing for crisis situations since she was old enough to understand what her father's profession had required of him. They ran through the terminal toward the airport operations center, Ronald clearing a path through crowds of confused travelers while speaking rapidly into his radio to coordinate access and equipment setup. Patricia Williams, who had removed Maya from the flight 90 minutes earlier, stood in the operations center looking like she was about to vomit as the full consequences of her decision became horrifyingly apparent. Get her on that radio immediately, the airport operations director commanded, pointing toward a communication console that had been pre-configured to the emergency frequency where Jessica Chen was coordinating with air traffic control. Maya took a headset from a trembling communications technician and keyed the microphone with the same steady hand she'd used to hold her father's dog tags during 18 months of chemotherapy that should have broken her but instead forged her into something stronger. Southwest 2847, this is Falcon. First Officer Chen, I'm on the ground at DFW and I'm here to help walk you through every option available for getting that aircraft safely on the ground. The sound of Maya's voice in Jessica's headset, calm and professional and carrying an authority that transcended her 11 years, hit the pilot with relief so powerful it was almost physically painful. Falcon, Southwest 2847, thank God you're there. I have complete hydraulic failure on all 3 systems, minimal flight control authority through rudder and stabilizer trim only, and I'm alone in this cockpit with 247 souls depending on me to figure out how to land an essentially uncontrollable aircraft. I need you to help me think through options I might be missing and confirm the procedures I'm considering. Maya's mind immediately began processing the scenario through the framework her father had taught her and the lectures she'd absorbed from wounded pilots at Walter Reed who'd shared every lesson learned from their own emergencies and near disasters. First Officer Chen, you're going to get through this and everyone on that aircraft is going to survive, but we need to work together and we need to be smarter than this emergency is difficult. I need you to tell me your current altitude, airspeed, fuel status, and whether you still have normal engine operation on both engines. Then I need you to describe exactly what flight control responses you're getting when you attempt inputs through the rudder trim and stabilizer trim systems. For the next 47 minutes, while Flight 2847 descended toward Denver International Airport and Jessica struggled to maintain some semblance of controlled flight using only the limited control authority available through trim systems. Maya coordinated an emergency response that drew on knowledge she'd accumulated through genetics, training, and the kind of preparation that comes from growing up in a military aviation family where technical competence was a matter of life and death. She walked Jessica through differential thrust techniques that used asymmetric engine power to help coordinate turns, talked her through airspeed management strategies that would keep the aircraft controllable without hydraulics, and helped calculate the precise descent profile that would give them the best chance of reaching the runway. The air traffic controllers at Denver Center cleared every aircraft from the airspace surrounding Flight 2847 and extended the runway to maximum available length while coordinating emergency response teams that included every fire truck, ambulance, and rescue unit in the Denver metro area. Maya contacted retired Air Force pilots who'd experienced similar emergencies and conference called them into the coordination network, building a brain trust of expertise that surrounded Jessica with collective knowledge that no single pilot could possess. She calculated landing speeds and touchdown point targets, helped coordinate the flight attendant's cabin preparation for a potentially catastrophic landing, and maintained constant communication with Jessica to prevent the isolation and panic that could overwhelm even experienced aviators. Falcon, I'm 3 miles from the runway threshold, descending through 400 feet, and I have almost no flare capability to prevent a hard touchdown, Jessica transmitted with her voice tight from concentration as she fought to maintain control of an aircraft that wanted to kill everyone aboard through simple physics and failed hydraulics. I'm going to have one chance to get this right, and if I miscalculate by even a few knots or a few feet of altitude, we're going to cartwheel down this runway. Maya's voice came back instantly, steady as bedrock and carrying the absolute conviction of someone who knew they were right because they'd done the homework and run the calculations and verified every number twice. First Officer Chen, you are going to touch down at 167 knots, approximately 1,200 feet past the threshold, and you are going to survive this landing because you are one of the most capable pilots I've ever worked with and because 247 people are counting on you to be as good as I know you are. Trust your training, trust your calculations, and trust that everyone on the ground is ready to deal with whatever happens after touchdown. Now fly that aircraft onto the runway and show everyone watching why you earned those wings. Flight 2847 crossed the runway threshold at Denver International Airport with Jessica Chen's hands locked on the control yoke and her feet working the rudder pedals with microscopic precision to maintain alignment with the centerline using only differential thrust and prayer. The Boeing 737 touched down hard exactly 1,247 feet past the threshold, its landing gear absorbing an impact that was harder than normal but still within structural limits. The aircraft bounced once, settled back onto the runway, and Jessica immediately deployed the thrust reversers while using differential braking and rudder to maintain directional control as the aircraft decelerated from 167 knots to a full stop. Emergency vehicles swarmed the aircraft before it had completely stopped rolling, firefighters taking positions while paramedics rushed aboard to treat Captain Hayes and begin evacuating passengers down emergency slides. Every single passenger and crew member walked away from that aircraft alive, some with minor injuries from the hard landing and emergency evacuation, but all breathing and intact and blessed with survival they would spend the rest of their lives being grateful for. Jessica Chen sat in the cockpit for 5 full minutes after shutdown, her hands shaking with post-crisis adrenaline as the weight of what had just happened crashed down on her with delayed recognition of how close they'd come to disaster. She keyed the radio one final time to the frequency where Maya was still monitoring from Dallas, her voice breaking with emotion that professional composure could no longer contain. Falcon, this is Southwest 2847. We're down safe. Everyone made it. I could not have done this without you, and I need you to understand that 247 people are alive right now because an 11-year-old had more courage and knowledge than most adults will ever possess. Thank you doesn't even begin to cover what I owe you. Maya sat in the operations center at DFW surrounded by airport personnel and airline officials who were staring at her like she'd just performed a miracle. Patricia Williams stood in the corner of the room with tears running down her face, the full weight of her catastrophic judgment crushing down on her as she recognized that she'd nearly killed 247 people through impatience and assumption. She approached Maya with trembling steps and a voice barely above a whisper. "Maya, I am so profoundly sorry for what I did to you at that gate. I made assumptions based on your age and I didn't take the time to verify your documentation properly, and my impatience almost caused a disaster that would have killed hundreds of people. I have no excuse for my behavior." Maya looked at the woman who'd humiliated her and removed her from a flight she had every right to board, and she made a decision that her father would have been proud of. "Mrs. Williams, I accept your apology. What happened at the gate was wrong and it hurt me and it almost had terrible consequences, but you're a human being who made a mistake under pressure. I hope you'll learn from this experience and maybe take an extra 60 seconds next time to verify information before making assumptions about what people are capable of based on their age or appearance." The airline's crisis management team arrived within hours, and by the following morning Maya Rodriguez had become a national news story. The footage of an 11-year-old girl coordinating an emergency landing from an airport operations center while the adults who'd removed her from the flight watched in stunned recognition became the defining image of a story that dominated every news outlet. Aviation experts appeared on television to explain how Maya's knowledge and composure had saved 247 lives, how her understanding of emergency procedures exceeded that of many professional pilots, how the combination of her military family background and her time learning from wounded aviators at Walter Reed had created someone whose capabilities defied every assumption adults make about children. The passengers from Flight 2847 who had whispered their judgments about Maya while she was being removed from the aircraft now watched those news reports with crushing shame as they recognized themselves making assumptions and criticisms about a child who turned out to be exponentially more capable than any of them. Many contacted the airline requesting Maya's information so they could write personal apologies. Captain Richard Hayes survived his massive stroke through immediate medical intervention and extraordinary luck, though he would never regain the medical certification required to return to airline flying. When he was well enough to understand what had happened, hospital staff told him about the 11-year-old who'd helped save his aircraft after his brain had betrayed him. He wept openly as he tried to find words to thank someone who prevented his medical emergency from becoming a mass casualty disaster. The Federal Aviation Administration launched a comprehensive investigation into the Flight 2847 incident to extract every possible lesson that could prevent future occurrences and improve emergency response protocols. Investigators interviewed Maya extensively, and senior FAA officials found themselves taking notes as an 11-year-old walked them through her decision-making process. The FAA's final report included specific recommendations for improving pilot training, emergency coordination procedures, and the integration of ground-based expertise into airborne crisis management, citing Maya's performance as the standard that professional aviators should aspire to achieve. Jessica Chen visited Maya 2 months after the emergency, bringing with her a custom leather flight bag bearing both of their call signs embroidered on opposite sides with a simple inscription between them, "Together we flew through fire and brought everyone home." Jessica explained that she wanted Maya to know that their partnership in that crisis had forged a bond stronger than normal friendship could ever create, that she would never forget the voice that had guided her through the worst moment of her professional career. Maya kept that flight bag on the same shelf where her father's medals documented a different kind of service, and sometimes late at night she would look at it and think about the strange path that had taken her from a cancer patient at Walter Reed to the girl who'd saved 247 lives because wounded warriors had respected her enough to teach her everything they knew. She thought about Patricia Williams who'd removed her from that aircraft, and Jessica Chen who'd trusted her to help save it, and her father who'd given her both the knowledge and the character that circumstances had required her to use. The real lesson of Flight 2847 wasn't just about aviation or emergencies or the specific capabilities Maya had demonstrated in crisis. The real lesson was that respect and competence and courage don't arrive according to anyone's schedule or expectations, that they emerge when dedication meets circumstances and preparation meets necessity. Maya had saved 247 lives not because she was exceptional or blessed with abilities beyond normal human capacity, but because people at Walter Reed had respected her enough to teach her everything they knew, and because when crisis demanded it, she'd been ready to use that knowledge regardless of whether anyone thought an 11-year-old should possess it. And every time someone somewhere chose to verify information before making assumptions, chose to respect capability regardless of its source, chose to recognize that age doesn't determine worth and experience doesn't monopolize wisdom, They honored the legacy of the 11-year-old who'd been kicked off a plane and then called back to save everyone aboard because she'd earned the right to carry her father's call sign and the responsibility to use everything it represented.